I don't know a single poker player that loves pocket tens. It's a very complex hand, very tricky to play, both preflop and postflop. You're going to have to deal with overcards a good chunk of the time, but still, it's one of the strongest starting hands you can be dealt. So we got to talk about it. Let's get into the science of pocket tens. Good morning, how are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and welcome back to another video in the Science of Poker series, where we analyze popular starting hands from a technical point of view and give you tips for playing these hands better both pre-flop and post-flop. And today we're going to talk about pocket tens, literally nobody's favorite starting hand, but it's a hand that you're typically going to play pre-flop, and as such you're going to have a good handle on how to handle this thing post-flop. So let's first, before we get into the technical stuff, let's just have a raw understanding of why people tend to hate this hand and why people, well, not necessarily love it, but tolerate pocket tens. Starting with why people hate it, pocket tens is going to have to deal with an overcard on the flop and no 10 almost 63% of the time, which is a lot. Pocket tens as an overpair is vulnerable to being outdrawn on postflop since there are 4 overcards that can hit the turn or river. Pocket tens can be a tough hand when facing a lot of postflop action, really tough to kind of figure out where you are and should you be sticking around or maybe not so much. Even when tens flops big, tens has a higher chance of being outdrawn on by the river compared to bigger pocket pairs like jacks plus, and tens is fairly indifferent when it faces a 3-bet after opening from the cutoff and earlier. Now that's a pretty big list of reasons to dislike pocket tens, but there are a couple reasons to like it. One is that tens can be strong enough to stack off pre-flop, especially button versus blinds or blind versus blind. A set of tens is a complete powerhouse and nearly always wins the hand post-flop, which is pretty great, and tens is flexible enough to both 3-bet and call in almost any situation when facing an open raise pre-flop, even though in steal-resteal situations, blind versus big blind, it should be a pure 3-bet as a default. And I think it's also important to have a baseline of what to expect with pocket tens. So you should expect a mixture of single raised and 3-bet pots with this hand. Some preflop stack-offs are advisable, but mostly only in late position, or if there are smaller effective stack sizes. Decisions with your postflop overpairs when having tens is when bet sizing and bluff catching decisions are really going to impact your win rate, and a larger number of middle pair situations when we have to apply pot control and play somewhat passively postflop is going to come up a decent chunk of the time with pocket tens. Now with all that out of the way, let's get into the technical exploration of pocket tens, and to do this we can pull out Flopzilla Pro. And if we start by popping in pocket tens right over here, we notice a couple different things. First, if we look at simply 2-pair or better, so smashes, you notice that's happening 12% of the time exactly. If we also factor in for single pair hands, that's everything from overpairs to third pair and even pocket pairs below third pair, right, for the times that there are 3 Broadway cards bigger than it on the board. We notice that brings us up to the other 88%, so 100% hits right this moment. And when we also factor in draws, including flush draws, open and straight draws, and also gut shots, we notice there's going to be a 7% chance of that happening, and that's of course going to have overlap with the single pair hands. And if you're looking for your nerdy fact of the day, here it is. Pocket tens is more likely to flop a straight draw than pocket jacks due to its central location. The higher an overpair above tens, the less likely it is to flop a straight draw. Pocket pairs between pocket 5s and 10s are most likely to flop a straight draw overall, so if you actually look at the math, tens is going to flop a straight draw 5.2% of the time, jacks 4.3, pocket queens 3.3, etc. But if we zoom out from straight draws right this moment and just look at the total way that pocket tens is going to hit flops, there are essentially 3 major scenarios. Scenario 1, we flop an overpair with or without a redraw. Scenario 2, we flop second pair or lower with or without a redraw as well. Or, of course, third, we flop a set or better, which is an absolute smash and monster. Now I'll give you some tips for playing all 3 of those scenarios a little bit later, but let's first start by talking about preflop tips when holding pocket tens. So one of the common themes when we're going through these preflop tips is you're going to notice, especially compared to say the Science of Pocket Aces or even the Science of Pocket Jacks videos, is that the tens start to get a little bit more fluid, less rigid in these overall rules, and that's okay, it just lends to the complexity of the overall hand. But tip number 1 with pocket tens is to be more inclined to be aggressive when 3-betting and 4-betting in later position wars, and a little bit more call-y in the early position wars. If you look through a good chunk of GTO preflop ranges, you're going to notice that tens is usually a mix when it comes to 3-betting and 4-betting preflop, but just in general, if it's a later position war, your ranges and your opponent's ranges are wider. Typically there's going to be more aggression from your pocket tens versus when things are a little bit tighter, both in terms of the open raising range and even the 3-betting ranges. then oftentimes tens is going to be played a little bit more on the calling side of the spectrum. Preflop tip number 2 with pocket tens is to, as a default, defend against those 3-bets. Again, if you look at preflop GTO ranges, you're typically going to find that pocket tens is going to be a mix when you open and face a 3-bet. However, there is one very specific spot where massively folding a ton of your tens is going to make a lot of sense, and that's when you open from early position and your opponent 3-bets and they 3-bet large when they have position on you. When that's the case, oftentimes overfolding in this spot, even with pocket tens, a hand which you normally would defend against 3-bets, actually is very, very correct, and very, very few people do this. So if you're a live player and you know you're facing those very large 3-bet sizes, you open from early, might be a good spot to start wrapping it up early rather than feeling like you have to auto defend here. Tip number 3 is that when it comes to squeezing pocket tens, pay a lot of attention to where the opener is. So if the open raiser is in later position, they open, there's one or more callers, and you have pocket tens, very, very typical spot to just squeeze with your tens there. However, if the opener is from early position, say under the gun, and there's one or more callers, you might be a bit more inclined just to call in that situation, again, because those open raising ranges from early position are so much tighter, it actually is going to make a little bit more sense to put tens into your calling or overcalling range specifically, instead of just default squeezing with it in that spot specifically. So pay attention to the raising position of the open raiser. The next tip is to understand when pocket tens can be a default stack off preflop. And hint, position plays a big role here. So unless you're playing with really shallow stacks, so let's just assume you're playing cash with roughly 100 big blinds effective, in that situation, the really only times that you're going to be able to correctly get pocket tens all in preflop is if both players are in the button, small blind, and big blind. So if you have a steal-resteal war, that's oftentimes where tens can get all in preflop correctly. However, if you're constantly doing this in earlier position battles, that's oftentimes going to be a losing proposition, or if the stacks are much deeper. But again, you have to make sure to know your opponent. If you're just default getting tens all in preflop regardless for 100 bigs from all positions, I'd say you're massively leaking somewhere along the way. Alright, so I think you're starting to get the idea with the preflop tips with pocket tens, but now let's switch it over and look at postflop, and we're going to break this into 3 different parts. First part being when we just have pocket tens and flop an overpair. Tip number 1 when you have pocket tens and flop an overpair is to typically consider betting large. So when pocket tens flops an overpair, it's typically considered a vulnerable overpair, and you'll notice that the GTO solver really likes betting large in this spot, even sometimes overbetting. If you take a situation, say a 9-5 deuce rainbow board, you have pocket tens, run it through the solver in a button versus big blind scenario, you're actually going to notice even in a single raise pot, the solver actually likes overbetting a decent chunk of the time with pocket tens here. Same thing even with pocket jacks. And even in 3-bet pots where betting something like 1/3 pot is pretty darn standard, you actually notice that the solver is even liking 50 or 75% pot bets as opposed to the even smaller size. So keep that in mind when you have the overpair. If you're just constantly making these smaller bets, which are, yes, normal in terms of most players do it nowadays, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be best. Think about how vulnerable it is and choose a sizing strategy that works from there. Tip number 2 with pocket tens is when you flop an overpair in a 3 or 4 bet pot, typically don't fold. Now, if your opponent's really nitty and it's just a situation where they never ever bluff enough of the time, sure, you can consider folding that overpair, but as a pure default, if you are in a 3 or 4 bet pot, you should be massively increasing your stickiness, again, assuming there's not massive stack depth at play. If you're constantly trying to find fold with tens in a 3 or 4 bet pot, I'd say you're probably doing yourself a disservice with an overpair, because again, it's just one of those spots where folding it is going to be very nitty and should only be done against the correct opponents. And tip number 3 with pocket tens as an overpair is to play more cautiously on coordinated boards. Now, this doesn't mean that you want to get overly nitty and just constantly start check folding all the time. However, if the board is very coordinated, say it's like 7-6-4, you want to be a little more cautious, especially if your opponent calls you on the flop and you have to go and turn, right? There's a lot of different ways for that turn card, especially when you maintain an overpair on the turn, to not necessarily be the greatest thing for you. And just for the record, if your opponent could flop a realistic straight on the flop, let's just say it's 7-6-5 instead, so things like 8-9 are quite possible for your opponent, then typically the overbetting thing we talked about earlier is kind of going to go out the window when the board is that hyper coordinated, and again, those possible straights are made right that moment on the flop. And the final tip when your pocket tens maintains an overpair postflop is to typically go for 3 streets of value. Now the caveat here is exactly how the board ends up rolling out. So if the draws are improving, then typically you're not going to be able to get all 3 streets. You're typically going to have to check the river more often, but if the river is a total brick off, then it's one of those where you can go for that 3rd street more often. So really think about how the draws are actually improving, and obviously that can be a little interesting when you have tens as an overpair, because it's either going to be a paired board kind of scenario, most likely, or it's going to be very, very low and possibly coordinated. So again, if you can get the 3rd street, cool, but if you're not sure, definitely just keep in mind how many draws are improved, and if most of them improved, then most of the time you're just checking the river and not getting that 3rd street. Alright, so we've hammered pretty well the times we have pocket tens as an overpair postflop. Now let's switch into everyone's favorite spot where we have pocket tens and we're dealing with 1 or more overcards on the board. Tip number 1 when we have pocket tens and we're dealing with 1 or more overcards is to typically play it passively. This means that when we find ourselves in this scenario, we should be checking as a pure default. That means whether our opponent checked us and we're closing action, we should just check behind, or we should be checking to our opponent. It's not vulnerable enough or strong enough in order to warrant playing it aggressively. So typically checking is going to be correct. Tip number 2 is that when you have pocket tens as second pair, typically it's going to be worth at best a single street of value. Now there can be some exceptions here depending on the exact run out and the specific sizes being used, but if you're constantly trying to get 2 or 3 streets of value when you have pocket tens as second pair, you're typically losing more pots than you should and bigger pots than you should be as well. So typically you're just going to have to calm down, cool out, maybe you get a street of value somewhere along the way with second pair, but if you're constantly trying to make those bigger pots, you're typically going to be losing them, unfortunately. And the third tip here is that pocket tens, when it is not an overpair, is hardly ever turned into a bluff. Pocket tens just kind of fits into this weird gray zone of like, it's strong enough, you just really don't turn it into a bluff in these spots, and that's totally okay. There are some exceptions, like for spots where the board has multiple overcards and we block the nut straight, but that's really kind of few and far between. So this hopefully helps you start thinking about the way you want to approach pocket tens when you're dealing with that common texture, right? One where you're dealing with 1 or more overcards and you have to figure out what to do with it. I hope these tips help a tremendous amount. And I guess I did say that I'd cover spots where pocket tens, flops, etc. are better. I know, really tough situation. Here are just some rapid fire tips for you to keep in mind. Number 1, we're almost always good to play for stacks in this spot. Unless the board is 4 straighted or 4 flush, something like that, typically go for the big pot, 3 streets, bang. Definitely make sure to be careful if the stacks are deep, and again, there's that kind of higher thing available, either higher sets and your opponent's repping them reasonably, or again, made straights, made flushes that make a lot of sense for your opponents. Yeah, those are the situations where you might slow down a pinch, but typically, yeah, just again, keep firing. And against most opponents, we should not be overly concerned with balance, but rather we should be selecting bet sizes that allow us to potentially get all of the chips in by the river, especially if you're playing smaller games, be it smaller live games, micro online games, whatever it is. Typically just look for big pots, build them as quickly as possible, use the larger sizings, and take advantage of the fact that your opponents are going to continue too often, and while they maybe don't continue as much as you'd like, when they do continue and they will pay that premium, charge them that premium. Use the larger sizes, build those pots as quickly as possible, and just, don't complicate it. Just get the money in. But at the end of the day, pocket tens is really one of the most important hands that you play, and can really define whether you're more of a beginner player or getting into more advanced strategy. If you're still working on this and you're trying to understand some of the concepts we talked about today, work through them, and really understand things like the GTO side of things compared to the exploitative side of things, I would definitely suggest checking out my advanced poker workbook if you haven't already. Splitsuit.com/advanced to learn more about it, but it lays out all of the exercises you need to be doing to compare preflop ranges, to compare the overall GTO output post-flop, to look at common spots and representative spots that really impact your win rate. And as a bonus, you can definitely point and look to, hey, where is pocket tens fitting into this situation? Is this a spot where tens is oftentimes getting regressive or getting more passive? And you're going to be able to uncover those patterns, not just for pocket tens, but everything within your range by working through these kind of representative spots. If you're looking to get more value out of the poker software you're already using, things like Flopzilla Pro, things things like GTO Plus, and you really want to start working on the stuff that matters in the right way, again, the Advanced Poker Workbook is going to be right up your alley. Splitsuit.com/advanced, or look for the Advanced Poker Workbook on Amazon if you prefer paperbacks. Is going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you have any comments or questions, please do not hesitate to let me know, and of course, a thumbs up on the video if you enjoyed it would be massively appreciated. Otherwise, I'll see you back shortly with a brand new video, and in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.